and available on our Lotus blog at hopehealgrow.org. We are thrilled to host today's webinar, All Men Can. This will highlight the importance of men leading in their circles to support survivors, strengthen families, and empower communities to create a culture where sexual violence and oppression are not tolerated. Our featured speakers will share their personal and professional reflections on their experiences as male leaders in the movement to prevent sexual violence. And today's speakers include Dr. Anton Reese, Richie Kemp, and Sherman Neil II. Our first speaker, Dr. Anton Reese, has served as president of West Kentucky Community and Technical College since 2016. Dr. Reese brings 30 years of communications and higher education administration expertise. Under his leadership, WKCTC is a record 5-time top 10 ranked community college in the nation by academic influence, as featured in Forbes magazine, and ranked #1 community and technical college in the state by bestcampus.com. Our second speaker, Richie Kemp, is the founder of Kemp Law Group and serves as Graves County Commonwealth's attorney, formerly serving as assistant Commonwealth's attorney for 10 years. He was also an assistant county attorney for nearly 10 years. Under Kemp's leadership, multiple specialized units of prosecution were created within the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, including the Vulnerable Victim Unit. In 2010, Kemp was honored with the Children's Advocacy Center's Legendary Partner Award. And finally, Sherman Neil II is the former assistant football coach at Murray State University and a student at the University of Miami School of Law, pursuing a master's in law. Sherman served 10 years in the United States Marine Corps, including military justice, platoon commander, and supporting infantry operations to include 2 deployments to the Middle East. He is an attorney experienced in family and criminal law. Sherman also serves as a criminal justice advocate for Amnesty International in Kentucky. And so we are so grateful to have these amazing panelists with us today. And without further ado, we will transition to today's panel. And so our first question for our featured guests is, how has your upbringing influenced your perspective on sexual violence? How have cultural definitions of masculinity affected your perspective?
The first thing that came to my mind when I heard that question was, well, first off, thanks for having me, and it's an honor to be here. But the first thing that popped into my mind when I heard that question was Pepe Le Pew. When you're a child, and well, I'm sure everyone's seen that cartoon. Children were entertained by a cartoon character that was not only not respecting boundaries of a woman, but what would be criminal behavior, and it was provided as a means of laughs for kids. And you know that obviously is a dangerous precedent. Another thing that I thought about in our area that's problematic in this regard is a level of victim blaming that goes on. How much has a woman had to drink? What did she have to wear? How late was she out? While you know, I'm a father of 2 daughters, 14 and 10, and I certainly talk to them and will continue to talk to them as they get older about ways to be careful in situations. But if under no circumstances do those justify any kind of assault or attack on them. So I think victim blaming in our area, particularly more with older people than younger people, is a problem too. But also think briefly that there's signs that it's getting better. When I was in college at Murray State, there in law school at SIU, there were no classes for men on boundaries that were okay and what kind of conduct is acceptable or not. But my wife went to West Kentucky Technology more recently and Frontier University. And at both of those, they had mandatory classes for men about those subjects, so that if they weren't taught that younger, they'll know that for the college experience. So I think there's trends in the right direction.
I'll jump in right behind Richie, and like Wes mentioned, thanks for this opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel with both Richie and Sherman. This is a very important issue. It's a challenging issue. There are a lot of sensitivities around it. You know, I'd like to put, if you will, maybe a cultural spin. So I'm from Barbados in the Caribbean, a country that is probably about 70% under the old Anglican, I think we call it in the US, the Episcopalian. It's a very dominant religious society, even as we speak. But there are religious implications, because I would submit to you that both religiously, which also impacts culture, that's the whole male-dominated, right, head of household, ultimate rule, ultimate authority. You know, those carryovers, I do believe, are linked in many ways to, unfortunately, some of the challenges associated with sexual assault and those sort of issues. Still keeping with the both religious and culture, in many ways, you know, there are always those no-nos, right? I mean, there's certain things that we just don't talk about because it could be embarrassing to the family. And, you know, the family name is the game, right? Is another aspect I would add into it. Again, culturally. Fast forwarding, you know, I was also a former athlete at Eastern Kentucky University. And as part of the training, what little bit we had back in the day, by the way, it was very minimal, mostly, I call it policy talk, but in terms of really getting at the heart and the core of how we interact with females, et cetera. Certainly things like Title IX, I mean, I've been to college back in the 80s, right? Those were just not that prominent, let me just say that, in terms of what's happening in the college setting. And then third, and certainly not least, spent over 3 decades interacting with various communities, you know, across this country. And I say it's a complex problem too, because there are also political underpinnings, financial underpinnings, legal underpinnings, and it's the reason why I think it is timely and important that we do bring more men prominently into the forefront as advocates for this challenging issue.
I'll follow up on that. Appreciate having me on again, especially with Dr. Reese and Richie here. I'm learning as we go. I've learned from them, just researching their backgrounds. So number one, to answer the question of how sexual violence has played a role in my upbringing, I actually started out by writing down, you know, who am I and kind of intersectionalities. And one, Black, man, and masculinity. And so just those 3 things in the question alone, kind of touching on what Dr. Reese talked about as a Black man before you just talked to being a man. Culturally, you know, my mom's side of the family is from West Africa in Liberia, and then my dad's side is from the South in South Carolina. And fortunately had a lot of strong women on both sides of that surrounded, but it's also culturally where we don't, you know, address these issues in the same manner that maybe other cultures have. I don't want to guess, but it's just not at the forefront of what we talk about. Now that may be generationally too, given, you know, what's happened with the Me Too movement. And so that might be that. So I've been trying to figure that out, but I know that that's part of my upbringing right now. It's part of being a man, period. When I looked at my own background and what makes me the man that I am, it's athletics, the Marines, advocacy, really being at the forefront. Not a lot of room to do the things that we don't traditionally associate with men, which is, you know, be emotional or take a step back or, you know, do the self-care stuff that we talk about, but half of us really don't do. Usually it's at the forefront. You put that at the back burner and you put the mission first, and there's consequences to that. And so that's affected my understanding of sexual violence. And then, you know, with masculinity overall in the society that we're in, what I immediately did when I wrote this down was like, I wrote down that I have not been impacted directly by sexual violence because it didn't happen to me. And I don't know any, you know, physical things that happen to family members. And I realized I just did the most American thing that you can do as an American man. And it's the same thing we hear with colorblind society. Like imagine, you know, how is it possible when you're living in a state that has the #1 rate of sexual violence in a country where it's prevalent, it's an epidemic, pandemic issue. And you can say, well, I didn't see it directly, so I don't know. It's colorblind, it's all great. And imagine explaining that to somebody suffering. So I had to step back and recognize, you know, how did I miss what's surrounding us? And so I've been directly impacted without even knowing it. At this point, I'm still going back through and doing a good exercise now, looking at that. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Wow, thank you for sharing those just vulnerable reflections with us, Mr. Neal. And I know that Dr. Reese had touched on this, but I'd like to explore it a bit further. Considering your professional background and expertise, how did you become an ally in the movement to end sexual violence, and what has that looked like in your life?
Well, Sherman mentioned a real important thing, right? Which is, if you are not directly impacted by it, the next important thing is raising the awareness about it, right? And so in some of my prior roles as Dean of Students is the closest I've come to getting involved, in situations involving sexual assault. And there's an entire process, right, through Title IX associated with that. So one part is raising the awareness through knowledge of the issue in the first place. I think that's one important place. He also mentioned something I think is also important too, though, second, which is just the evolution, I think, for manhood, if you will. So let me be more specific. I grew up in an era of time as a much younger man in the 70s and the 80s, where not just with myself, but I've certainly learned this in conversation with my peers. The thought of having a dialogue with your father, I mean, an exchange where there's like expectations and that guidance and how you deal with women and that type of thing, was a foregone conclusion. It basically, during that genre time, it was providers, right? My dad, who I only knew when I was very, very young, was almost like a shadow. Worked, came in, rotated in and out, was a disciplinarian. There was very few inquiries, questions, it's a dialogue type thing. And so in many ways, you learn aspects of manhood in how you engage with women, in this case, from your peers, right? And that's not always accurate or good to follow as well too. So I believe that that's another important part of it. But then third, and certainly, we do mandatory trainings that also elevates the level of awareness for faculty, staff, and students, which I think is really important. And it would be great to get it expanded actually through society, through our religious nonprofits organizations as well.
My professional background is in what I do now as a prosecutor. So going back to 2007, I've been the guy in our office who handles most of the sexual abuse cases involving children and women. They are the most difficult cases we have. There's often not any physical evidence or witnesses. I mean, these are oftentimes crimes of secrecy, particularly when you're talking about abuse of children. And then when you do have DNA evidence or something like that, it comes down to who you believe, whether or not there was consent or not. So because the Commonwealth or the prosecution has to convince all 12 people, and trying to get 12 people to agree on anything is challenging, and trying to do that beyond a reasonable doubt, it is a struggle to get justice for victims of these kind of cases. And it's so important because not only does that particular victim deserve justice for what they went through, the data shows that people who commit crimes of violence against women will repeat those crimes if they're not held accountable. So it's important that we do as good a job as possible as prosecuting and holding these guys accountable, because when you see someone get away with it, it makes the next woman or the next girl less likely to come forward, and it makes the process harder. So as a prosecutor, I'm right there on the front lines, I would say. And I'd also say that I work with Lotus a lot, and I want to give them a shout out because they do a tremendous job from doing the forensic interviews at the beginning, which is an investigative tool, which helps us a great deal, to providing counseling for coping mechanisms for victims who've gone through bad things, but also trial prep counseling so that when they go to court, they know where everybody's sitting. They know what questions are going to get asked. They do an amazing job.
Just to follow up, so I have kind of a hybrid of both of those experiences, not extensive experience in either. When we're talking law and higher education. And I was thinking about the hashtag that we use for this, all men can. And if there's anybody that's proof of that, it's probably me, because I've done it through learning and failing, and then listening to other people. And I say that with career number one really being an attorney and working with a child and family law clinic with indigent clients in West Virginia, and being eager to address the problem, being eager to help these families to the point where, and Richard will probably laugh at this, I'm giving out my cell phone number and I give the call me any time of the night. I don't understand what that means for these families going through this. And if you work at Lotus, I didn't understand that meant, you probably need some training to be able to answer that call at 1:30 in the morning when somebody is saying daddy is touching 4-year-old. I didn't have that. I learned, by listening and going through it that way, but I never really knew if the answer was, turn it off and don't assist, or, go all in and assist. And what I should have realized is that you need formal training. We need more things like this to go back and learn how to do it. That led me to second experience, really being a platoon commander in the Marines. So as a platoon commander, I have 70 Marines to take care of. And one thing that sticks out to me more than almost any experience, deployment or otherwise, is the day I was sitting in my office and a Marine comes up to me and he says, ex-Marine has a 16-year-old girl in a motel room across the street. What do you do? And so in retrospect, I'm glad that whatever I did to create an environment that was permissive, that they would tell me that existed. But and I'm also terrified the level of, where I was at as a 22-year-old in charge of those guys, and I didn't have the training to address that properly. Luckily, my seniors did. And we see in the military now, there's a push-pull in responsibility, because I had good leadership that walked me through that. What happens if you don't? And what happens if they're self-interested? Do you need a third party, et cetera? We don't have to figure that out here. Congress is trying right now, but it's tough. But that's why at an individual level, I saw that early on, by every level. And Richie talked about being on the front lines, like everybody's on the front lines when it comes to this almost. And then thirdly, as a football coach, it's really more of a reconciliation with talking to 22-year-old selfish, or 19 to 20-year-old selfish. Y'all two mentioned, what you had in college, and I thought about myself, and that's just 2006. Facebook just came out in like 2006 when I was out there. People were putting everything there. So like, I go back and I look at, what I heard, what I didn't hear, what I probably should have heard, and knowing that it's not gonna, be a tsunami of change, but just small things like taking 15 guys, all men cook, to know that, these organizations exist and that the people are normal, and that, you can talk and use your platform in ways that don't have to, tear down stuff. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, but the key is just listening and reaching out for help when you need it.
Well, it's clear that each of you have used your professional experience to support survivors and advocate against sexual violence, and we really appreciate that. And as we continue to reflect on that, do you find it difficult to talk about sexual violence prevention and the societal norms perpetuating rape culture with the people in your life? Why or why not?
I was gonna say, my ego tells me no, but my actions show that I do have difficulty addressing it directly. And something that I've noticed is part of the reason I'm probably talking to this group in Western Kentucky today is because I've been involved in some community organizing here that really is being led by a lot of women. And two of the women that I was thinking about that have supported this have both openly shared their experiences with sexual violence. And I realized that I had not directly talked to them about those experiences, yet they talked to me or listened to me about my own experiences as a Black man in Western Kentucky for almost 9 months now. So how is that possible? It's either that you don't know how to talk about it or you're avoiding it because it's difficult, although they put it out there. And it just made me, when I started researching the origins of the Me Too campaign, and realized that all it took essentially is the same thing that I did. It's just somebody put out a single letter, or Alyssa Milano, I want to say, highlighted a campaign that was already in existence, similar to what's going on with a lot of the social justice movements out here. It just took a couple people to respond and it turns into 10,000. So for me, I've recognized that, I need to address those people that have helped me, and then just in general, more directly, more often, because it can spark a larger movement and change.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of thoughts on there as well too, right? So certainly from my perspective, I think one is, oftentimes this is my first opportunity, first of all, to be invited to formally make any sort of presentation, right, along such a complex and in many ways sensitive sort of topic. So I think one part is either opportunity, be it given, and or seeking opportunity, right, to be part of it. So I think that's important as well too. So I think ways in which organizations like Lotus and related areas, can create more opportunities, for men to be more involved, certainly is one area I would definitely want to push. I think second, I think your level of advocacy has a lot to do with knowledge, right? Because the worst thing you want to do is to misspeak or heaven forbid, make situations worse, right? Like most folk, I like to be as informed as I can in terms of what it is I'm talking about. I keep mentioning this piece about the importance of ongoing education and awareness. So, I look back during my tenure at the University of Tennessee, where I was involved in student life and student affairs. I remember, we had the annual sexual assault walk, right? Candlelight walk through campuses, and then the program, the highlights, if you will, were listening then to sexual assault victim survivors and learning firsthand from quite a few of them actually, that their first encounter wasn't even on campus. Oftentimes it happened earlier in the homes. They talked about the trauma, even though they may be an individual impacted. In some cases, it was more than just them, right? And then the reasons why they felt ashamed didn't come forward. The financial control that the parents had over their situation, right? Added yet another layer. So it's almost like coming out of almost like a culture of secrecy and shame combined, but I thought it was very courageous hearing from victims speaking out. Certainly through the lens of my wife, who worked as a social worker. Sherman mentioned his military background. She worked with the Fort Campbell for quite some time, dealing with victims and certainly families impacted in different ways. And just, hearing just how this thing is just so complicated because of the hesitation of victims coming forward. And if they do, the implications and what the support resources will look like. And of course, Richie has just scratched the surface with the whole legal arena and probably how much is involved. I don't know, can afford legal services, but if it goes to court, the public shame. I mean, it's a really complex situation, but it is an important situation that needs more light and certainly more advocates to be speaking on behalf of it.
I would say that conversations like this are always difficult to have, but I think that the Me Too movement has definitely got the dialogue going more and got more victims comfortable coming forward and talking about it. And I think it's led to men being better at receiving that. Sherman brought up little things that can be done. And part of the question is about societal norms perpetuating rape culture. And thinking about that reminded me of an incident where I play a lot of fantasy football. I spend entirely too much time every fall on fantasy football. And when we make trades with other players, if someone come out way ahead, it's often referred to as trade rape. You trade rape that person. Well, I quit using that term and was like, guys, we've got to find a better way to say someone got beat in a trade than saying, throwing the word rape around. And I think little things like that that you can do in your own life, that spreads, and it's a good thing to spread. Anyways, I think doing little things like that to try to change the that rape culture can be helpful.
Thank you all. Yeah, I love how you, Richie, highlighted just those small actions can go a long way when we're acting collectively. And so our next question is, what ways have you seen laws, policies, and societal norms discourage men from intervening as an upstander? And we are using the word upstander, which just means someone who takes action rather than being a bystander. So again, what ways have you seen laws, policies, and societal norms discourage men from intervening as an upstander in situations of potential violence?
Well, I can say societal norm wise, I believe that a lot of times domestic violence, which is often accompanied by sexual violence, was viewed as a private matter between a husband and a wife, and that's becoming less and less the view of it. And for example, it used to, you would never dream of being able to get a conviction for a husband for raping his wife. Now I've prosecuted multiple husbands for raping their wife, and that's not, wife's no longer looked at as a piece of property for the husband to do with what he wants. And we're continue to go that route. There's also been strengthening laws to protect women. And this needs to happen more with two areas. One that's happened that's good news is strangulation. Often if you put your hands around a woman's throat to restrict her breathing even a little bit, that would usually just be part of an assault fourth. Now, which is a misdemeanor crime, max punishment 12 months, and they usually don't get that long. Now it is a felony offense where they can go to prison from anywhere between 5 to 10 years for that act. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, obviously the chances of that person dying are significantly more, even though it doesn't always lead to the same kind of injuries that a severe assault, a more severe assault might. But people that do that are I forget the exact statistics, but far more likely to assault them again, and far more likely to murder them. A lot of women who've been murdered by their significant others have been strangled at one point or not. So that's a good thing that happened. Another one that needs to improvement is people who are accused of these kind of crimes, violence, sexual violence, having access to firearms. There are some rules or laws against that on the books, but they need to be strengthened. And some places there aren't any. We do have that, and but it's not everywhere. And we know that when you hear of like gun laws, you should think of that as a woman's protection law. Men with access to firearms are far more likely to kill their spouses or their girlfriend, and if they've got a history of assault, the statistics are off the charts. Women are in danger if in that situation.
If I could follow up on that real quick. The firearms one is interesting because back when I used to do domestic violence protective order hearings in West Virginia, I remember it was crazy to me that, you would get through the hearing, you would talk about the temporary protective order going in place and list all the restrictions going into it, where the dads or moms can't see the kid, stay a certain way. And it would take until the last part, which is part of VAWA, and you have to turn in your firearms, and they're like, "Whoa, hold on now, like, chill out, like, this is crazy." I'm like, bro, they just said that they're taking away your kids for an indefinite period of time, and you're not visioning until you hear about the firearms. And so it sounds trivial, but it's real as a deterrent in doing that. And that actually gets them to interact with the police more than they would have otherwise, with the kids just being taken away. So I just thought that was interesting from being in West Virginia and doing it. And then a second time, talking about societal norms. So when I was leaving the Marine Corps, so I served in infantry battalions, and particularly in 29 Palms, California, which is middle of nowhere. And we returned from a deployment, and we were actually going to be one of the last, if not the last unit to integrate. And it sounds crazy to use that word, but we had no women at the time. And we used to, I know Richie was talking about his fantasy football league. For about a month to month and a half, we had to have mock meetings to try to eliminate talking in terms of like hypersexualization, using phallic objects for every other thing. And we realized like we almost weren't capable of having a meeting. Like certain people couldn't be in the room until like they received ways to talk like that wouldn't get us all, fired or worse, or in a hearing before Congress. And Richie talked a lot about like the actual crimes that he saw and sees every day. I knew at the time from my experience, like I wasn't seeing it, but it definitely perpetuated a culture where there's going to be more likely to happen. And all the things that Dr. Reese talked about that his wife saw were happening as a result of that at a higher rate than would have happened had we stopped some of it. And so just going through that process and seeing how painful it was and how much we had to change to even function, in a integrated environment, let me know that, by not saying anything, by not having these types of meetings, by not being frank, that, I was contributing to what was going on base and outside of base and in the service overall. And it doesn't make you a bad person, but once you recognize that and you don't do anything, then you probably got some serious questions you need to have answered for yourself about priorities. So just going through that from a societal norm standpoint, just as recently as 2 years ago, is interesting. And we see the end state now, which is a better for us, in my opinion.
So let me add real quickly too, then along the theme of maybe social norming, and we haven't mentioned this angle as much, but I think certainly through social media and actually, quite frankly, the movement has really amplified and raised the bar significantly, just in terms of their themes like see something, say something. You look at a lot of high-profile cases that have come forward. In some ways, it is still almost like there's almost like that kind of wall of where within some organizations or within some group of men, they keep it pretty close, right? And in some ways, I watched the evolution of the debate. So it goes almost like this. So first, you hear about a sexual assault situation, if you hear about it. Through time, it has evolved from, well, what did she do? What does she deserve it? Right? So it's almost like a rationalization because there's no way, because no means no. Following the evolution, this whole thing. But to me, it has really shifted much more just in recent years, I would add, where it is tipping more so where, again, I think men as a whole are just becoming more aware and more educated and more willing, if you will, to tip the scales the other way, right? That we don't get into victim blaming, that we really try to understand the importance of, again, getting a good sense of what the situation is, and then how do you lend voice to it. I bring the media piece up to it too, because it has also raised a couple of things. I think things like statute of limitations. So at what point do you say something and when does that expire becomes a factor in there somewhere, one. And two, how much level of involvement do you get involved? Because then you get into whether it's the public perception and or reputation, right? So I keep using this theme that it gets complicated, but I don't want that to be misconstrued as the reasons why we should not continue and push for more advocacy and having more men standing out. I think it is ways to educating how you can make an informed decision, informed level of support, timely support, and speaking out in a way at best where we recognize and understand the importance of supporting victims and getting them the necessary resources that they need, be it legal, social, financial, etc. I would also add into the conversation.
Thank you. And with that being said, I'm going to plug Lotus in here for a moment. We do offer various types of training and education whenever it comes to preventing and intervening with sexual violence. And so if there's anyone who'd be interested in learning more about that, again, you can visit our website, hopehe'llgrow.org. And with our next question, we know that the impact of sexual violence is widespread beyond the immediate victim. For example, sexual violence is among the most costly of crimes. Do you think sexual violence impacts everyone? Why or why not?
I would say I believe it definitely impacts everyone, from children, spouses, anyone who's close to someone who's had to go through this will know that it's women need a support system to heal from this kind of violence, and having those people to help children, family, spouses, parents is good, but it impacts them too. I mean, it's never an easy thing to see someone you care about hurt. I have women in my family that have been victims. each instance I'm talking about, I learned about long after it had happened, but it impacted me a great deal. A lot of emotions there, anger to other emotions, but I definitely don't think it's limited to just the victim herself. And I would refer, I think a good example of this can be seen, and there's a documentary called I'll Be Gone in the Dark. It's about the Golden State Killer and how he was captured. This is a serial rapist. And it's fascinating, one, about how he got caught and all that. But also, though, there's interviews there with many of his victims and their spouses, and you can see the emotions in the family members' faces of what they're going through. And they're talking about rapes that occurred decades later, and it's still raw with them. So I definitely think it impacts everyone.
If you want to look at it from a strictly economic standpoint, right now you can look at Louisiana State University, LSU, you can look at Baylor, you can look at Kansas, and look at, multiple millions, if not billions of dollars that have to go into addressing a problem that could have been addressed and should have been known about. From an athletic standpoint, and that engulfs whole universities in these lawsuits. And is it about the lawsuits? No, but in reality, there's a real cost, just like there's a real cost to not putting in certain criminal justice reform. Like there's dollars and cents to that. So why is it critical for people that are in institutions of higher learning, or specifically in athletic departments like I was, to address it? It's because, one, as a person, we know that we can't prevent 100% of the things that happen. What I would hate to have happen is tomorrow you open the newspaper and you see, player from team that I was on commit something, and that they look at calendar over the past year and there's been zero, actual training or discussion time allotted. And Dr. Reese talked about it as an athlete. He's like, yeah, we get the, click through, the Title IX brief, but what happens past that? How are you putting that into practice? How are you role playing that in scenarios that most of these kids have never been in, certainly haven't been in all together at the same time away from their house. So it's a high risk situation, and there's an obligation there to be fiscally responsible and protect them and protect the institutions. And I recognize I'm not saying the victims here, it sucks, but I mean, the facts are that it's happening, and so we have to take preventative steps until we know how to fix the systemic issues. And then you see the same thing play out even in a military standpoint. It took until there's congressional hearings and intervention to come up with real solutions and real reporting mechanisms. So maybe if we can't reach out to Lotus, or if we aren't doing it to ourselves, or we don't have that type of tool, I know it will be forever ingrained into me: restrictive reporting, non-restrictive reporting, how to handle these things, more so than how to handle a rifle, just because that's the level of importance that they placed on addressing this issue, which was costing time, money, and reputation, in addition to the tangible harm that comes with having to remove families from bases, et cetera, that we talked about earlier.
Two quick things I would add regarding the cost and the impact. Sherman did a great job of illustrating high-profile lawsuits and the impact financially, but it impacts everyone too, because then whether it's the victim's ability to provide for their families, a lot of time the trauma could be so significant that they're not able to work. It could be in relationships. Those involved in relationships with those who have been sexually assaulted obviously didn't do the crime, but they're going to also help with the healing of the trauma, right? And then certainly the impact that it may have on the victim's family, kids, et cetera. So in many ways, what is well publicized is the financial settlements from the high profile cases, but the societal cost is just significantly larger. And, as a society, we need all hands on deck in terms of being, healthy, contributing members of society. That is incredibly compounded by those on some level impacted by sexual assault. So we all bear costs, and then we support great organizations, by the way, like Lotus. We were very happy to recognize Lotus as one of the organizations that we supported as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. But ultimately, it does have significant costs. both financially, emotionally, culturally, and society as well.
Well, thank you for those reflections. And Dr. Reese, we definitely appreciate that recognition. As we wrap up our discussion today, we've heard many great ideas and inspiration for being upstanders to prevent sexual violence. What is one thing that men or all people can do to create a world free from violence and oppression?
I can begin. Something to do to prevent. What I would say is look for signs. Oftentimes, this is about sexual violence, but that's often accompanied by domestic violence or people in abusive relationships. My niece was telling me the other day about two of her friends that have boyfriends who like monitor their phones, don't let them hang out with certain people where there's going to be other boys around, like really controlling type stuff. And when you see somebody in that situation, some of the questions we had to review were about intervention. And sometimes it's the intervening is recognizing that someone's in a bad spot and saying, hey, try and talk them out of it. But even if you can't, you can maybe encourage them to go to counseling. The problem with people in these relationships, a common problem is low self-esteem. By maybe talking to someone, they can see their self-worth and that they deserve better and they deserve to not be controlled like that. I think that's a good way to do it. And also try to see things from women's perspective. My wife told me about a class she had where they asked the men, what kind of precautions do you take when you go out? And they wrote the answers on the board. And one of them was, I wouldn't walk down a dark alley by myself, or I would, make sure I lock my car. And then they asked women and they filled up the board with precautions. Like I don't go to a party by myself. I don't let my drink out of my sight while I'm at a party because someone might put something in it. I make sure that I have my keys in my hand so that if someone comes up to me when I'm walking to my car, I can jab at their eyes. They hearing what women are concerned about versus what men are concerned about is way different. So try to see it from that perspective. And lastly, I think this is illustrated. I can't quote my source on here, but I know I'm correct on this. When men were asked what their greatest fear of women were, the answer was being laughed at by the woman. When women were asked what their greatest fear about men were, it was being murdered. So I would encourage everybody to look for the signs of these kinds of problems and things like Denim Day help where you're raising awareness. That's a famous case out of Italy that where a rape trial was overturned because the woman's jeans were too tight, according to the Court of Appeals. It's astonishing, but having things like that, Sexual Abuse Awareness Month, all things like that bring attention to this matter and help men to do a better job.
I say, so two quick things. One, as she came up, I think there's a question in the chat about, how do you distinguish between legit, illegitimate? The answer is do not. Listen, absorb it, and then try to support that person. If you can't, because either you don't believe it or, morally there's some issue with you, refer that person to get help somewhere else. Because the worst thing that you can do is tell them that their voice doesn't matter and what they're relaying to you doesn't matter. So none of us, I'm speaking for myself, I certainly am not an expert. I doubt that there's many qualified experts out there that are hearing these things. So do not. And then, the second is find a way to actively support organizations like Lotus or individuals trying to address this matter, because I think, I want to make up statistics, but 1 in 5 women have suffered a sexual assault, I want to say. And that's assault. We're not even talking about harassment or anything else that is, an epidemic now. And look into your own workplaces and your own practices as well, and who you're getting advice from. One of the smartest things that I've heard over the past couple of months was from a woman who was a sports executive, and she gave us a task of build your own board of directors and see who would be on it to help you with decision making. And when I went down and I wrote that, I came up with 5 men. And then when I came up, I was struggling, to look past that. And I recognized, where I have gaps and, how I have to build relationships. So, support others and then build relationships as you go through that process of supporting that are meaningful and authentic. So that way you help yourself make better decisions and then, make the whole community more aware.
I would quickly add two things. There is an adage, first of all, I think it is important that the education empowerment gets in earlier. There's an adage that goes, it is easier to raise conscious boys than to deal with angry men. One, I think two, I think the arenas where there are male leaders of influence. So I put this forth as a challenge to our religious leaders of our various community organizations and nonprofits, that using their various voices, all right, be it the pulpit, be it social media, etc. I can't think of ever going into church and hearing a sermon related to, sexual assault, right? And that may not be the arena for it, but certainly as part of the, the Sunday school teachings, etc. From, again, start early in churches. I think Boys and Girls Clubs, get in early, and let's have those voices of influence, being on record, if you will, ways in which they want to encourage and foster the importance of how we should respect and uplift, right? There's a adage I remember years ago where, there's a lot about men being providers, right? And strength, right? So we see these hands. So what do? Do we uplift our women, or do we beat them down, right? That gets back into a change of consciousness and education and retraining and reframing with accountability. And last and certainly not least, it takes funds and resources, because there are financial implications. So to our lawmakers or mayors or county judge executives, those with influence, certainly that they could provide more funding for important organizations like Lotus would be my last piece.
Wow, well, thank you for those just powerful statements and reflections. And with that being said, we appreciate everyone for dedicating their time and energy to learning more about the importance of men leading in their circles to support survivors, strengthen families, and empower communities to create a culture where sexual violence and oppression are not tolerated. Today, we all have the opportunity to create a world free from violence and oppression. And this really starts with our own values, behaviors, and the norms that we appreciate or perpetuate. We have discussed some really sensitive topics today. And if you've been impacted by sexual violence or you're needing help, you can always contact Lotus by visiting hopehealgrow.org. And once again, we really do appreciate our featured speakers for sharing their thoughts and reflections with us. And if you would, please complete our post-event survey. Thank you.
Thank you.